The cold of the cobblestones hit his back before he even had a chance to open his eyes. Tae-hyun sat on a wet rock in his work jacket, with the sleeves rolled up. His fingers were slightly burned from yesterday's shift. The scar on his chin from the butcher's knife was still there. It was all him. It was all familiar, except for everything else. The air smelled of wood smoke, but without the grease. Like bread, but without the crust, as if someone had taken the smell of a kitchen and stripped away everything that makes a kitchen. A kitchen. A woman in a long, floor-length dress walked by. She was carrying a basket filled with something gray and crumbly. Tae-hyun watched her go. The woman entered the shop across the street and placed the contents of the basket on the counter. The sign above the door was made of wood, with letters he didn't recognize, but somehow managed to read. It said one word: bread. Tae-hyun looked at his hands, then at the street. Narrow, stone, no asphalt, no wires, not a single streetlight. People in strange clothes walked past him, and no one stopped. He stood up. His knees were stiff. His head was buzzing like after a double shift. He walked over to a bench and looked into the cloudy glass of the storefront. His face, his cheekbones, his eyes with their perpetual shadows from lack of sleep. He touched the glass with his fingers, and it turned out to be real. Then he turned around and went to look for the market, because if this is a new world, the first thing a cook does in a new world is go sniff out what's growing here. He found the market 3 streets away, a square with wooden awnings, sacks, barrels, baskets. People haggled in muffled voices without any enthusiasm. Tae-hyun walked along the first row, carrots, pale, almost white. He picked one up from the counter, and the vendor didn't even flinch. Apparently, stealing something like that was beneath a thief's dignity. Tae-hyun took a bite. He chewed for 5 seconds. He stopped. He took another bite. Nothing. No bitterness, no sweetness, no earthiness. Nothing. The shape of a carrot, without the substance of a carrot. He put it back and moved on. A turnip. He took a bite. Same thing. An onion. He sniffed it. A faint hint of scent, like an echo in an empty room. Meat on hooks. Stringy. Gray. No marbling. No fat. No smell of blood. Fish on wetboards. Dull. With cloudy eyes. He picked one up by the tail and looked at its gills. Gray. Bread on a separate counter. All the loaves were identical, same size, same color, same shape. He broke one in half. Inside was the same gray mass as on the outside. No air pockets, no crust, no aroma. He put the bread down and looked at the people around him. They were eating, they were buying and eating, calmly, as if it were routine, as if that's just how it's supposed to be, as if food were simply something you put in your mouth so you don't die. Tae-hyun stood in the middle of the market and felt something akin to horror rising inside him. Not fear of the new world, not panic over not knowing where he was or why. The horror of a cook who realized he had ended up in a place where food was dead. He stood there like that for a minute. Then he shoved his hands into his jacket pockets. In the right pocket, he found a coin, a copper one. A foreign coin with the profile of someone wearing a crown. He didn't know where it had come from, but that didn't matter. Something else was important. He looked around again. He found a stall selling salt. The salt was gray, like everything else. Coarse, damp. He licked his finger and poked at the pile. Salty. Only slightly, but salty. The first thing in this world that had any taste. He nodded to himself. Then he turned and walked back to the alley where he'd woken up. He had no home, no money except for that one coin, not a single familiar face, but he had his hands. And somewhere in this world was salt that, even if only a little, actually tasted salty. He'd figure out the rest. Tae-hyun spent the evening of his first day behind the bakery wall. The baker let him sleep in the woodshed in exchange for Tae-hyun hauling 3 sacks of flour from the yard for him. The flour was just as gray. Tae-hyun rubbed it between his fingers and sniffed it. Wheat, sort of. But it was as if its soul had been sucked out, leaving only the body behind. He lay down on the firewood and stared at the ceiling for a long time. The ceiling was stone with wooden beams. Through a crack in the wall, he could see the sky. The sky was whitish, without a trace of blue. Like a faded photograph, he closed his eyes. His body ached. His temples throbbed. He remembered the last thing that had happened before he ended up here. Wet asphalt, the smell of soy sauce. His soy sauce. He'd made it himself that day. A blow to the temple against something hard. And that was it. He didn't know if he was dead. He didn't know if he was alive. He only knew that in this world, food had no taste and that this was the most terrifying thing he'd seen in his 29 years of life. The morning of the second day began with a smell. Tae-hyun woke up to the sound of someone rummaging through the trash behind the bakery wall, quietly, as if it were routine, just like people who rummage through trash every day and are no longer self-conscious about it. He peeked out, a girl, about 17, skinny, her hands were bony, her hair was dirty and tangled, barefoot. She was wearing something that had once been a dress, but was now a rag. She pulled a piece of that gray bread out of the trash can and ate it quickly, without chewing, like a little animal. Tae-hyun watched her for a minute. She didn't see him. She ate and stared at the ground. Then she finished eating. She wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. She stood there for a moment. Then she walked on. Tae-hyun stood in the doorway of the shed and watched her go. Then he looked at his copper coin. Then back at the girls retreating back. Then he went to the market. The coin was enough for one onion, a piece of meat with veins, which the butcher gave him almost for free because it was considered scraps, 3 pale carrots, a pinch of salt in a rag bag. Tae-hyun returned to the alley behind the bakery. He found 2 bricks. He stacked them to form a makeshift hearth. He gathered some kindling. He found a tin can with no bottom and used it as a stand. He asked the baker for some water and an old cracked clay pot. The baker gave him both, looking at him as if he were crazy. Tae-hyun cut the onion in half. He didn't have a knife, so he used a sharp stone. The cut was ragged, but that didn't matter. He placed the onion halves, cut side down, directly on the hot brick. No oil, no fat, just on the dry, scorching stone. The onion sizzled. The smell filled the air. For the first time in 2 days in this world, something real smelled good. Charred onions, bitter, slightly sweet smoke. Tae-hyun flipped the halves over. The cut surface was black. That wasn't how they did things in this world. Here, onions were thrown into water, raw and boiled, until they turned to mush. He knew this because yesterday he'd watched the baker prepare them. Tae-hyun put the charred onions in a pot. He poured in water. He added meat cut into pieces with the same stone, carrots broken by hand, salt. He put it on the fire, and he waited 2 hours. He crouched in the alley and skimmed the foam with a fragment of a wooden spoon he'd found in the bakery's trash. Passers-by would sometimes stop. They'd sniff the air. They looked at him. They walked on. No one asked what he was doing. 2 hours later, the broth was ready, slightly cloudy, golden from the onions, with a thin film of fat shimmering on the surface. Tae-hyun tasted it. He closed his eyes. It was a poor broth by his standards, weak, with a barely noticeable flavor. The meat was tough. The carrots were bland, but it was broth, real broth, the first in this world in God knows how long. He poured it into the clay bowl the baker had given him along with the pot. Then he went to look for that girl. He found her 3 streets away from the bakery. She was sitting on the steps of a boarded-up house, picking at a crust of bread off her finger. Tae-hyun approached. He held out the bowl. She looked up at him from below. Her eyes were gray, huge. Frightened, she asked why he was doing this to her. Her voice was quiet and hoarse. Tae-hyun didn't answer. He just held out the bowl. She took it with both hands. She sniffed it. Her eyes grew even wider. She looked at him again. He nodded. She brought the bowl to her lips and took her first sip. She froze. Tae-hyun had seen this 1,000 times in the restaurant. That moment when a person tastes something and the world stops for a second. But he had never seen what happened next. Tears rolled down the girl's cheeks. Not from pain, not from grief. From something for which she had no word, because there were no words left in this world to describe that taste. And along with the tears came a light, golden, warm, like the setting sun in a glass. It emanated from beneath her skin, from her eyes, from her fingers. The bowl slipped from her hands and shattered on the steps. The girl stood up, but she was no longer a girl. The filthy rags had vanished. In their place, she wore a linen dress that hadn't existed a second ago. White, pure, her bare feet on the wet stone. Something slowly swirled above her head, a wreath made of ears of grain. Golden, full, heavy ears of grain that hadn't grown in this world for 300 years. She looked at her hands, then at the empty, broken bowl, then at Tae-hyun, and slowly sank to her knees. Tae-hyun stood before her, his mind methodically running through the possibilities. A hallucination, poisoning, a coma, death and deathbed delirium. But the girl's knees touched the wet stone, and her dress began to get dirty, and it was too real to be delirium. He told her to get up. He said she was going to get her dress dirty, and he didn't wash it. She looked up at him with eyes full of golden light and tears. She said he didn't understand. She said he had awakened something in her that hadn't been there for 300 years. She said she now had to serve him. Tae-hyun blinked. He looked at the broken bowl. He looked at the wreath of wheat ears. He looked at his burned hands. He said he didn't know who she was or what had happened, but he knew she hadn't eaten properly in a very long time, and that he still had half a bowl of broth left, and that if she wanted to, she could go with him and eat a proper meal. She met his gaze. The wreath above her head spun slowly and silently. The ears of grain rustled, even though there was no wind. She stood up. She wiped away her tears with the back of her hand, exactly the same gesture she'd used that morning to wipe her mouth after eating the stale bread. And she followed him. Tae-hyun walked ahead. Behind him walked a barefoot goddess in a white dress. He didn't turn around. He was thinking that the broth had already cooled down and needed to be reheated, and that tomorrow he needed to find a decent knife, and that something in this world was very, very broken, and that he had no idea what to do about it. But he could reheat the broth. That's where he'd start. They returned to the alley. Tae-hyun stoked the coals. He set the pot down. She sat on the ground beside him and watched as he stirred the broth with a splinter of wood. The wreath above her head slowly faded. It dissolved, as if it had never been there. All that remained were her dress and her eyes, gray, huge, but no longer frightened. She said her name was Isla, that she didn't remember her last name, that she was 17, that she'd been living on the streets for 5 years, that she didn't know what had happened to her, but that this broth was the first meal in her life that made her want to live rather than die. Tae-hyun poured her another bowl from someone else's bowl because the first one had broken. She drank slowly, her eyes closed. He sat across from her and watched, and for the first time in 2 days in this world, he thought that maybe this wasn't hell. Mom, maybe it's something else. He didn't know exactly what yet. Tae-hyun woke up in a world where food had no taste. On the second day, he cooked broth for Ayla, a homeless girl, and she turned into the goddess of the harvest, wearing a wreath of golden ears of grain. Tae-hyun didn't understand what had happened, but he took her with him to the alley behind the bakery where they were hiding. The night after Ayla woke up, Tae-hyun didn't sleep. He sat in the bakery's shed, watching the girl curled up on a pile of firewood, breathing evenly. Her dress was clean, white, not a single stain, even though she'd been sitting on the ground and on the wet steps. He touched the fabric with his finger while she slept. The fabric was real, linen, thin, but it didn't get dirty. Tae-hyun withdrew his hand and sat in the darkness for a long time. In the morning, he was the first to go out. The baker was already at work, kneading dough in a wooden trough, gray dough, odorless. Tae-hyun stood in the doorway. The baker looked at him and asked what kind of girl he had in his shed. Tae-hyun said she was his sister. The baker snorted. He clearly didn't believe him, but he didn't argue either. People in this world didn't really care about other people's business. Tae-hyun stepped out onto the street. The morning light was just as whitish as it had been yesterday. The sun hung behind the clouds like a blurry smudge. He walked down the street, looking at the city. He hadn't had time to take a good look yesterday. The city was large. 2- and 3-story stone houses, narrow streets paved with cobblestones, signs in a language he didn't know but could read, artisan shops, shoemakers, tailors, a blacksmith with an open workshop. A temple on a hill at the end of the main street, large, with stone columns and a weathered roof. In the square in front of the temple stood a statue of a woman with her arms raised. Her face was worn away by time. Tae-hyun stopped in front of her. At the base of the statue was an inscription. The Forgotten Mistress. Below, in small letters, may she satisfy the hunger of the worthy. Tae-hyun read it twice. Forgotten, unnamed, not gone. Forgotten. He turned around and walked back. He had 3 problems to solve. A knife, money, understanding what had happened to Ayla. He decided to tackle the knife first. Knives hung in the blacksmith shop on the corner. Rough, heavy, with thick blades for chopping meat. None of them were suitable for normal work, but he had no choice. Tae-hyun walked into the blacksmith's shop and asked if he could trade his labor for a knife. The blacksmith looked at him as if he were an idiot. Then he asked what kind of work. Tae-hyun said he could cook. The blacksmith burst out laughing. He said any woman could cook, but he needed an apprentice to haul coal. Tae-hyun hauled coal for 4 hours. By noon, he had a knife. A bad one, heavy, with a crooked handle, but sharp. He returned to the shed. Ayla was awake. She was sitting on a pile of firewood, staring at her hands. The calluses on her fingers were gone. Her skin was clear and smooth, as if she'd never spent 5 years on the streets. She looked up when he walked in. She asked where he'd been. Her voice wasn't hoarse anymore, quiet but clear. Tae-hyun showed her the knife, and she looked at the knife and then at him. She asked why he needed a knife. He said he was a cook, that it was his tool. That without a knife, he was like a knight without a sword. She didn't understand the comparison, but nodded. Then she said something strange had happened that morning. She pointed to the corner of the shed. Tae-hyun looked. A sprout was growing in the crack between the stones of the wall. Green, bright, lush. The only splash of color amid the gray stone and the gray world. Ayla said she'd woken up and touched the wall, and it had grown. Just like that. Out of the stone. Tae-hyun stepped closer. He leaned in. The sprout smelled. It really smelled. Of greenery, of life, of chlorophyll. He breathed in the scent and closed his eyes for 3 seconds. Then he straightened up and looked at Ayla. She was sitting barefoot on a pile of firewood, wearing a white dress that didn't get dirty, and looking up at him. Gray eyes, waiting. He told her they needed to talk. They talked for an hour. Tae-hyun asked questions. She answered as best she could. She didn't know what a goddess was, not in the sense that she didn't know the word. She knew the word. Everyone did. But the last living goddess in this world had been seen 300 years ago. The temples still stood. The priestesses still served, but there were no goddesses. They had left, or died, or they had simply ceased to exist. No one knew for sure. Ayla said that yesterday, when she drank the broth, she felt something open up inside her, like a door that had been locked her whole life. And behind the door was light and warmth and a voice that said one word, grow. Tae-hyun listened in silence. Then he asked if she could control it. She shrugged. She stood up. She walked over to the pot that had held the broth yesterday. The pot was empty and dirty. She placed her palm on the rim. A second later, a green stem poked out of a crack in the clay. Then a leaf. Then another. A minute later, a small bush with dark green leaves was growing out of the pot. Tae-hyun plucked a leaf. He rubbed it between his fingers. He brought it to his nose. Basil. He sat down on the barn floor. He held the basil leaf between his fingers and stared at the wall. In his head, the chef was battling a man. The man said it was impossible and that they should panic. The chef said he had fresh basil and a knife, and that it was time to get to work. The chef won. Tae-hyun stood up. He told Ayla that they were going out. She asked where. He said to the market. He needed to figure out what she could grow and what they could cook with it. They walked down the street, and people turned to look. Not at him, at her. A barefoot girl in a white dress that didn't get dirty. People looked and then turned away, quickly, as if they'd seen something they weren't supposed to see. Tae-hyun noticed this, and he noticed one more thing. On the street corner stood a man in a dark robe, with a symbol on his chest, a silver ear of grain inside a circle. The man was staring intently at Ayla. Tae-hyun took her by the hand and turned into an alley. She asked what was wrong. He said they were being watched. She turned pale. She said the silver ear of grain was the symbol of the Church of the Long Fast. She said they kept tabs on everything related to the goddesses, or to what the goddesses once were. Tae-hyun asked what the church did to those it was watching. Ayla didn't answer, but he could feel her hand. She squeezed his fingers and wouldn't let go. They returned to the barn by a roundabout route through 3 side streets. Tae-hyun sat down and thought. He needed a place. Not a barn, but a real place. Walls, a door, a roof. A place where he could cook and where no one would see Ayla until he figured out what was going on. That evening, he went to the blacksmith again, not for work, for information. The blacksmith turned out to be quite talkative when he wasn't working. Tae-hyun asked if there was any cheap housing in town. The blacksmith laughed and said there was no cheap housing, but there was a neighborhood near the harbor where no one wanted to live because of the rats and the smell of fish. Tae-hyun asked how to get there. The blacksmith pointed the way. Tae-hyun set off. The harbor district of Mornhaven smelled of salt and rotten seaweed. The houses stood right up against one another. Many were empty. The windows were boarded up. The doors had been torn off their hinges. On one street, he found a small space between a rope warehouse and a closed fish shop. 2 stories. Downstairs was a room with a stone floor and a hearth. Upstairs was an attic with a leaky roof. There was a door. It was locked. Tae-hyun found the landlord through a neighbor, an old man with a cataract in one eye. The landlord asked if Tae-hyun had any money. Tae-hyun had no money. The landlord started to close the door. Tae-hyun said, wait. He said he was a cook, that he would cook lunch for the landlord every day in exchange for the first month's rent. The landlord paused. He looked at him with his one good eye. He asked what kind of lunch. Tae-hyun said a real one. The landlord laughed and said all lunches were the same, porridge and bread. Tae-hyun said his would be different. The landlord didn't believe him, but agreed. Apparently, he didn't care either way. The place had been empty for 2 years. Tae-hyun went back for Ayla. They moved in that night. She carried a pot of basil, holding it close to her chest like a baby. In their new place, the first thing Tae-hyun did was inspect the hearth. The stones were intact. There was a draft. It was usable. Then he looked around the room. It was empty. Dusty, with a single window facing a blank warehouse wall. No one would see what was happening inside. He nodded. He told Ayla that they would start tomorrow. She asked what they would start. He said, cooking. The third day began with Tae-hyun sending Ayla out to grow something. He described an onion to her, not the kind sold at the market, a different one, with a golden husk, with a scent that stung her eyes, with juice. Ayla listened, but didn't understand. She had never seen onions like that. No one in this world had. But she placed her palms on the ground behind the house. She closed her eyes. Tae-hyun watched. The ground was gray and dry. A minute later, a green stalk emerged from it. Then another. An hour later, a bed of onions was growing on a patch of land behind the rope warehouse. Tae-hyun pulled out one bulb, golden skin. He cut it open. Juice spurted out. Her eyes stung. He was kneeling in the mud behind the warehouse, crying from the onion juice, and because this onion was perfect. Ayla stood nearby, asking in alarm what had happened. He said everything was fine, that it was just an onion, that good onions make you cry. She didn't understand, but she smiled, for the first time in all the time he'd known her. Her smile was bewildered, like that of someone who'd forgotten how to smile and was trying to remember. That day, Tae-hyun was cooking lunch for his master. Onion soup, the simplest kind. 4 onions, thinly sliced. There was no oil, so he sautéed the onions on a dry, scorching hot stone in the hearth, slowly, stirring every 2 minutes. Here, they didn't know what caramelization was. Here, they didn't know that when onions are heated for a long time, they turn into something completely different, from a sharp, pungent vegetable into a sweet, dark golden mass with a scent that makes your head spin. Tae-hyun caramelized the onions for 40 minutes. Ayla sat in the corner and watched intently. The scent filled the entire room, then the whole house. Then it wafted out onto the street through the cracks in the door. He poured water over the onions. He added salt. He put it on the stove. He simmered it for an hour. He poured it into a bowl. He took it to the landlord. The old man lived 2 doors down. He took the bowl with one hand. He sniffed it. He froze. He looked at Tae-hyun. He looked into the bowl. He tasted it. Tae-hyun saw it. That moment, the very one, when a person tastes something they've never tasted in their life, and the world ceases to exist for a second. The old man set the bowl on the table. His one eye was wet. He said he didn't know food could be like this. He said he'd lived 60 years and hadn't known. Then he asked if he could have some more. Tae-hyun nodded. The host didn't glow. He didn't become a god. He didn't change. He just sat at the table and ate the onion soup and cried out of one eye. Tae-hyun returned to his home and sat down on the floor. Ayla asked why the host hadn't changed like she had. Tae-hyun said he didn't know, but he thought that maybe it wasn't about the food. Maybe it was about who was eating it. Tae-hyun got hold of a knife and found a room in the port district of Mornhaven in exchange for daily meals for the landlord. Ayla discovered the ability to grow any plant from a description and grew real onions. The Church of the Long Fast spotted Ayla on the street through its observer. The first week in the room passed at a rhythm Tae-hyun had known his whole life. Up before dawn, fire, water, knife, work. Ayla grew what he described. Carrots, real ones, orange, crunchy and sweet, potatoes, garlic that made his fingers burn, parsley, dill, green onions with stalks as long as his elbow. Every morning he would come to the garden behind the house and find something new. Ayla would squat nearby, waiting for his reaction. He would pick it, sniff it, taste it, and nod or shake his head. If he shook his head, she would close her eyes and try again. She didn't know what these plants tasted like. She had never eaten them. She grew them based on his words, on his descriptions of their smell, color, and texture. It was like a blind sculptor shaping a face based on a voice. But every day she got closer to the mark. Tae-hyun fed his master twice a day, in the morning and in the evening. Something different each time: vegetable soup, roasted root vegetables, braised meat with carrots and onions, which he cooked for 3 hours in a clay pot. The old man would come in silently. He would eat in silence. He would leave in silence. But one morning, Tae-hyun found a basket by the door. Inside the basket were 2 bowls, a wooden spoon, a clean rag, and a note written in crooked letters for the cook. Tae-hyun stood there with the basket in his hands, staring at the note. Then he took the basket inside and went to cook. On the 5th day, a scent wafted into the harbor district. Tae-hyun couldn't contain it. When he caramelized the onions, the scent escaped through the cracks in the door and window and spread down the street. When he simmered the broth, steam rose above the roof. When he roasted garlic on a hot stone, the scent pierced the walls. People on the street stopped. They sniffed the air. They looked around. They walked on. But the next day, they stopped again, and they stood there a little longer. By the end of the first week, 2 or 3 people were gathering at his door every evening. They didn't knock. They didn't ask. They just stood there and breathed. Tae-hyun saw them through the window, and he did nothing, because he didn't have any dishes to feed strangers, and because he didn't yet understand the rules of this world. Ela was changing too, a little bit every day. She began to walk upright. She straightened her shoulders. Her voice grew stronger. Her hair, which had been dirty and tangled, became clean, all on her own. He hadn't seen her wash it. It just became clean. Dark blonde, shoulder length. She began helping out in the kitchen. At first, she watched silently as he cut. Then she asked if she could try. He gave her a knife, showed her how to hold it, how to position her fingers, how to move the blade. Her cuts were crooked. The pieces were uneven, but she wasn't afraid of the knife. She had the hands of someone used to working. Tae-hyun silently corrected her grip, adjusting her fingers on the handle. She would freeze when he touched her hands. Then she'd continue cutting. By the end of the week, she could slice onions into rings of uniform thickness. On the 7th day, Tae-hyun went into the forest. He needed mushrooms. They didn't sell mushrooms at the market. Apparently, in this world, mushrooms weren't considered food, or maybe no one knew what to do with them. He set out at dawn. Ayla wanted to go with him, but he told her to stay. Don't stick your neck out. Don't go outside. The church observer hadn't shown up anymore, but that didn't mean he was gone. The forest began beyond the city wall, an hour's walk away. The wall was ancient, made of stone, with cracks that no one had repaired. Faint bluish lines glowed within the cracks. Magic. Tae-hyun saw them and tried not to think about it. Too many new things, one after another. The forest was strange. The trees were tall, but had small, pale leaves, like everything else in this world. Tae-hyun walked and sniffed the air. Earth, moss, rotten leaves. The scents were faint, but they were there. He found mushrooms 2 hours later, pale, slender-stemmed, with caps the size of his palm. He picked one, sniffed it, an earthy smell, faint but real. He snapped it in half. The flesh was white, firm. He bit off a tiny piece and held it on his tongue. Not poisonous, almost tasteless, but the texture was good. He could work with this. He filled his armpit and headed back. That was when he heard her. The sound came from a ravine, 100 paces from the trail. Hoarse breathing, labored, with a wheeze, like the breathing of someone with a damaged lung. Tae-hyun stopped. He could have walked right past. A sensible person would have walked right past. He didn't walk past. He climbed down the ravine slope, clinging to the roots. At the bottom lay a woman, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing chainmail with a torn shoulder. Her short, light hair was matted with blood. An old healed scar ran across her eyebrow. The wound on her thigh was fresh, ripped open, bandaged with a dirty rag. A sword lay beside her, long, heavy, with dark spots on the blade. She opened her eyes when he approached. Her eyes were light, cold, angry. She told him to leave. Her voice was steady, even though she was clearly dying. A commanding voice, accustomed to giving orders. Tae-hyun didn't leave. He sat down next to her on the wet ground and looked at the wound. It was bad, inflamed, hot, a smell he recognized, the smell of infection. He asked how long she'd been lying there. She said 3 days. He asked if she'd eaten. She didn't answer. That meant no. Tae-hyun stood up. He gathered some branches. He built a fire. He took some mushrooms out of his bosom. He pulled out a knife. She watched him with one eye. Her other eye rolled back from the blow. She asked what he was doing. He said he was making broth. She said she didn't need food, but a doctor. He said he didn't have a doctor, but he did have broth. She fell silent. Tae-hyun found a stream 10 steps away. He filled the helmet lying next to her with water. He put it over the fire. He sliced the mushrooms thinly and tossed them into the water. He found a pinch of salt in his jacket pocket, the kind he carried around in a rag bag, and added it. It wasn't enough. It was pitifully little. Mushroom broth, made from unidentified mushrooms, cooked in stream water with a pinch of gray salt. Any chef in Seoul would have looked at this and turned away, but Tae-hyun kept cooking. Because he'd realized one thing over the past week. In this world, broth made from unidentified mushrooms in stream water is a miracle. Because no one here makes broth. Here they boil water and throw whatever they have into it. No sautéing, no patience, no understanding that time is an ingredient. He simmered it for an hour. She didn't speak. She lay there, breathing, hoarsely, with a wheeze. When the broth was ready, he poured it into a helmet. There was no other dishware. He brought it to her lips. She looked at him for a long time. Then she opened her mouth. The first sip, she closed her eyes. The second, the third, she drank slowly. Tae-hyun held the helmet. When she finished drinking, she opened her eyes and looked at him. Her gaze had changed. The anger was gone. Something else remained. She said her name was Seora Kang, that she was a former captain of the Northern Border Order, that she'd been discharged after an ambush in which a spear pierced her thigh, that she'd come to this forest to die. Tae-hyun listened. Then he said she wouldn't die, that he still had mushrooms, that he'd make some more broth. She asked why. He said because she hadn't eaten in 3 days, and a person who hasn't eaten in 3 days has no right to make decisions about their own death. Eat first, decide later. She looked at him for 5 seconds. Then something flickered across her face, not a smile, a shadow of something that might have been a smile if she hadn't been in so much pain. Tae-hyun simmered the broth for another 18 hours. He didn't leave. He kept the fire going. He changed the water. He added mushrooms. When the broth thickened and turned dark and rich, he gave her a drink again. She drank. She slept. She woke up, drank. For 18 hours, he sat next to the injured stranger in the ravine and simmered broth for her. He didn't ask who she was, didn't ask how she'd ended up there, didn't ask about the scars. He just kept cooking. At dawn, she sat up, on her own, leaning on her arm. She looked at him. He looked worse than she did. His eyes were red from smoke and sleeplessness. His face was covered in soot. His hands were burned. She said the wound didn't hurt. He looked. The rag on her thigh was clean. He carefully peeled back the edge. Beneath it was skin, pink. New, no wound. He sat down on the ground and rubbed his face with his hands. She looked at her leg, then at him. She didn't glow. There was no golden light. There was no dress appearing out of nowhere. But the wound had closed, and her eyes had changed. They had grown 1 degree warmer. Tae-hyun told her he needed to go back to the city, that he had a girlfriend there who was probably already worried. Seora asked which girlfriend. He said it was a long story. Seora stood up. She checked her leg. She stepped down on it, firmly. Then she lifted the sword. It weighed 15 kilograms. She lifted it with one hand. She looked at Tae-hyun and said she was going with him. He started to say she shouldn't. She cut him off and said that he'd been feeding her for 18 hours without asking a single question, something no one had ever done for her in her life. She said she was going with him, and it wasn't up for discussion. Tae-hyun looked at her. She was tall, with broader shoulders than his, a sword in her hand, and the face of someone who'd been through things that normal people don't know about. He nodded. They walked back to the city in silence. When they reached the harbor district, Ayla was standing by the door. She saw Tae-hyun and exhaled. Then she saw Seora and froze. Seora looked at Ayla. Ayla looked at Seora. Tae-hyun stepped between them and said that Ayla was Ayla, and Seora is Seora, that Ayla grows vegetables, that Seora isn't doing anything yet, but she needs a place to sleep. Ayla nodded. Seora nodded. They went inside. Tae-hyun closed the door. He sat down on the floor. He looked at the 2 women standing on opposite sides of the room, silently sizing each other up. Then he closed his eyes. He hadn't slept for 2 days. His last thought before he fell asleep right there on the floor was that tomorrow he'd need to find another bowl. Tae-hyun had found the wounded former knight Seora King in the forest and had simmered mushroom broth for her for 18 hours. The wound had healed completely. Seora had come with him to the city. Now the three of them were in a room in the harbor district. The church hadn't shown up yet, but the threat remained. Tae-hyun slept for 14 hours. When he woke up, Ayla was sitting by the hearth, heating water. Seora was sitting by the door with her sword on her lap. They didn't speak. Tae-hyun sat down. He rubbed his face. He looked at one, then at the other. He said good morning. Ayla nodded. Seora didn't move. He stood up and went to wash his face. The water was in a barrel behind the house, cold, gray. He splashed it on his face, and his brain started working. He needed a strategy. 3 people, 1 room, no money, no food except what Ayla grows, 1 knife, 1 pot, and the church might be watching them. Tae-hyun went back inside. He sat down. He looked at Seora. He asked if she knew how to do anything besides fight. Seora raised an eyebrow, the one without the scar. She said she could butcher a deer. Tae-hyun nodded. That was something at least. He asked if she knew where in this town he could find a job. Seora said they were always looking for dock workers at the port. Tae-hyun said he didn't need a job as a dock worker. He needed a job as a cook. Seora gave him a long look. Then she asked why he needed a job as a cook when he could just cook here. Tae-hyun explained he needed money. With money, he could buy things that Ayla wouldn't grow. Salt, oil, if it even existed here, dishes, firewood, meat, fish, spices, if they're available. Seora listened. Then she said that there were taverns in town, but they didn't need cooks there because all the taverns served the same food: porridge, bread, bland boiled meat. According to recipes approved by the church. Tae-hyun asked again, according to recipes approved by the church. Seora nodded. 300 years ago, the Church of the Long Fast established a single list of dishes that were permitted to be cooked. Anything outside that list is considered heresy. Tae-hyun sat there, processing this. An entire world in which the church approves recipes. An entire world in which cooking your own way is a crime. He asked what the punishment was. Seora said that technically it was a fine. In practice, it meant the establishment would be shut down. Tae-hyun stood up. He paced the room, 3 steps in one direction, 3 in the other. Then he stopped. He said, "Fine." He said that in that case, he wouldn't work at the tavern. He'd open his own. Seora and Ayla looked at him at the same time. Ayla asked, "With what money?" He said, "None." They already had the space. There was a hearth. There was a knife. She was there, and she could grow things. All that was left was to find customers. Seora said that was madness. He said he knew. The first week, he worked like a machine. In the morning, he'd get up before dawn. He'd go to Ayla's garden. She was already sitting there, waiting. He'd tell her what was needed. She'd grow it. Then he'd go to the port. On the docks, fishermen were throwing away fish heads and spines. Here, they were considered waste. Tae-hyun gathered them into a bag and carried them home. Fish broth. Made from heads and spines, with onions, with salt, with a sprig of dill. He simmered it for 4 hours, strained it through a cloth, thick, cloudy, with the smell of the sea. The real smell, not that faint hint that lingered at the harbor, but the real thing, concentrated, pungent. Seora tasted it first. She stood there with the bowl in her hands, motionless for 10 seconds. Then she said she didn't know fish could smell like that. Tae-hyun said it wasn't fish, it's what they throw away from the fish. She looked at him with an expression he couldn't read. Then she silently finished the bowl. Every evening, people stood at the door. First 2, then 4, then 7. They came drawn by the smell. They stood there. They breathed it in. They left. On the 3rd day, one of them knocked, a middle-aged man, a dock worker, by the looks of him. Dirty hands, worn-out boots. He asked what they were cooking there. Tae-hyun opened the door. He looked at the man. He looked at the pot of broth. He poured a bowl. He held it out. The man took it. He looked at it, sniffed it, tasted it. He stood in the doorway with the bowl and said nothing. Then he asked how much. Tae-hyun said 1 copper coin. The man took a coin out of his pocket, placed it on the threshold, drank the bowl dry, left. The next day, he came with 2 friends. Tae-hyun poured 3 bowls. 3 coins on the threshold. A week later, he had 20 regulars, dock workers, fishermen, sailors from merchant ships, people who hauled heavy loads all day and ate gray porridge. They'd come in the evening, they'd knock, Tae-hyun would open the door, he'd pour them a drink. They'd drink, standing at the threshold, because he wouldn't let them inside. Ayla, was inside, and he didn't want to explain who she was or where she came from. Money appeared, copper coins. Not much, but enough. Tae-hyun bought a second pot, a third, 2 wooden bowls, a sack of salt, real salt, white salt. Not that gray junk from the market, but sea salt. One of the sailors had brought it from the southern islands. Tae-hyun tasted the salt and closed his eyes for 5 seconds. A real, sharp, vivid, with a mineral aftertaste. He bought the whole sack. The sailor asked for a gold coin. Tae-hyun didn't have a gold coin. He offered to feed the sailor for a month. The sailor agreed. The salt made all the difference. With real salt, his broths became 3 times stronger. The smell on the street became 3 times stronger. And the people at the door became 3 times more persistent. Seora took charge of keeping order. She stood at the entrance and made sure the line didn't get rowdy. No one argued with a 6-foot-tall woman who had a sword strapped to her back. Isla worked in the garden. Tae-hyun cooked. It was a system, rough, primitive, but it worked. On the 12th day, what Tae-hyun had feared happened. That evening, after the last guest had left and he was washing the pots in the barrel behind the house, Seora said they needed to talk. Tae-hyun dried his hands. He sat down. Seora stood over him, looking down at him. She said she'd seen 2 men that afternoon, in dark robes, with a silver ear of wheat on their chests. They were standing on the street corner, looking at the house. They weren't hiding. They were standing out in the open, as if they wanted to be seen. Tae-hyun remained silent. Seora said it was the church, that they knew or suspected that a man in the harbor district was preparing things not according to the approved recipes, that this was still a minor matter, a fine, perhaps a warning, but if they saw Ella, it would no longer be a minor matter. Tae-hyun asked why. Seora explained the goddesses had been absent for 300 years. They'd been waiting for them. They'd been searching for them. The church had performed rituals, dozens of rituals, hundreds. Not a single one had worked, and now a goddess appears. Not in a temple, not through a ritual, but in an alley, from a bowl of broth cooked by a stranger. This isn't just heresy, it's the destruction of the entire system the church has been built upon for 300 years. Tae-hyun was silent for a long time. Then he asked what Seora suggested. Seora said they could leave. There are other cities. Tae-hyun shook his head. He said he'd only just begun, that he had 20 guests, 2 pots, and a sack of salt, that he wouldn't run away. Seora looked at him. Then she nodded. She said, "All right." She said that in that case, she wouldn't sleep by the door tonight, but would sleep on the roof instead. From there, she could see the street in both directions. Tae-hyun started to say that she shouldn't sleep on the roof. Seora was already on the roof. He stood in the courtyard and looked up. Against the backdrop of the pale night sky, Seora's silhouette was so reliant aus piwidurio rokerbuiv fras wore the sword on her back, looked as if it had been carved from stone. He went back inside. Ayla wasn't asleep. She was sitting in the corner, hugging a pot of basil. She'd heard the conversation. She asked if they would take her away. Tae-hyun sat down next to her. He looked at her, gray eyes, big, frightened again. Just like that day on the steps, he said no one would take her away, that he wouldn't let them. She asked why he was so sure. He said he wasn't sure, but that as long as he was here, he would cook. And as long as he was cooking, she was safe. She didn't answer. She just leaned her shoulder against his. A minute later, she fell asleep. Tae-hyun sat there, staring into the hearth. The coals were smoldering. It smelled of onions, smoke, and basil. Rats rustled behind the wall. On the roof, a former knight sat silently with her sword, and he sat on the floor next to the goddess, who was holding a pot of basil to her chest as she slept, breathing quietly. He thought that in a past life, he too had owned a restaurant. 3 stars, 8 years, 60 seats, 20 chefs on. And not once in all those years had he felt what he was feeling now. Sitting on the floor in a rat-infested neighborhood in a world without taste, with 2 women he'd known for less than 2 weeks. He didn't know what to call it. But tomorrow, he would make the broth better than today. That much he knew for sure. Tae-hyun began selling broth through the door to dock workers and gained 20 regular customers. He bought sea salt and tableware. The Church of the Long Fast began openly monitoring the house. Seora warned that A's could destroy the foundations of the church's authority. Tae-hyun decided not to run away. The 3rd week brought 2 things. Tae-hyun had been expecting the first, not the second. The first was oil. One of the sailors explained that on the southern islands, they press a liquid from fruits that doesn't spoil and is used to lubricate machinery. Tae-hyun listened, and his heart began to beat faster. He asked what color the liquid was. The sailor said, yellow. He asked what it smelled like. The sailor said it had a strange smell. Tae-hyun asked if he could try some. The sailor brought a small clay bottle. Tae-hyun opened it. He sniffed it. Olive oil. Rough, cloudy, unfiltered, slightly bitter, but olive oil. He stood there with the flask in his hands, his fingers trembling. The sailor watched him warily. Tae-hyun asked how much it cost. The sailor named a price that made Tae-hyun's vision go dark. 3 gold coins per barrel. Tae-hyun had 14 copper coins. 1 gold coin was worth 100 copper coins. He told the sailor he would buy it. Not right now, but he would buy it. The sailor shrugged and walked away. Tae-hyun did the math. 20 guests a day at 1 copper coin each. 20 copper coins a day. 5 days for 1 gold coin. 15 for 3. If he didn't spend anything else, but he did spend salt, meat, fish, firewood. He sat down and thought. Then he stood up and went to the fishermen at the pier. He offered them a deal. He would feed them for free. They would bring him what they usually threw away. Heads, backbones, offal, small fish that the middlemen wouldn't take. The fishermen exchanged glances. They agreed. From that day on, his expenses for fish dropped to 0. Tae-hyun switched to 2 meals a day. In the morning, fish broth for the fishermen, for free. In the evening, thick soup for paying guests. The soup changed every day. Onion, mushroom, vegetable with potatoes and garlic, carrot with a pinch of something that Isla had grown based on his description, and that turned out to be a distant resemblance to ginger. Guests began to arrive earlier. They stood in line. They argued over seats. Seora put an end to the arguments with a single glance. On the 20th day, a second thing appeared, the one Tae-hyun hadn't expected. It arrived in the morning. Tae-hyun was at the pier with the fishermen when he heard a quiet voice behind him. The voice asked if it was true that there was a cook in the harbor district who didn't follow the rules. Tae-hyun turned around. A girl, about 24 years old, dark hair in a disheveled braid, glasses. Real glass glasses were a great rarity in this world. He recognized the cassock she was wearing. A church robe, but a different kind. Not black like those worn by the observers, but gray, faded. Too big for her. She held a book in front of her like a shield. Tae-hyun looked at her and weighed his options. A church spy, a trap, a provocation. The girl stood there, waiting for an answer. She was pale, dark circles under her eyes. Her hands were slender, with ink stains on her fingers. A bookworm? He'd seen people like that in Seoul's university districts. People who live in books and forget to eat. Tae-hyun asked why she was asking. She hesitated. She said she was looking for an address, that she'd been given a description of the street, but had taken a wrong turn, that she worked at the temple library, that she'd heard from one of the parishioners about a cook at the port, that she just wanted to. She fell silent. Tae-hyun waited. She said she just wanted to try it. Her voice was so soft he could barely hear her. She said she eats once a day, porridge at the library, that the porridge is the same every day, that she'd read in old books that food used to be different, that there used to be flavors and smells, that she thought maybe it was true. Tae-hyun looked at her. Her glasses had slipped to the tip of her nose. She held a book pressed against her chest. Her fingers were stained with ink. He told her to follow him. She went. He led her into the house. Seora, standing by the door, straightened up and placed her hand on her sword. Tae-hyun shook his head. Seora withdrew her hand but kept her eyes fixed on the girl. Ayla peeked out from behind the hearth. The girl stood in the middle of the room, looking around. The smell hit her first. She stood there, breathing, with her mouth open. Tae-hyun put a pot on the fire. He didn't make broth. He made something else. That morning, Ella had grown something based on his description. He called it millet, though it wasn't quite millet. Tiny golden grains. Tae-hyun rinsed them. He covered them with water. He boiled them until they were tender. Then he added milk. He didn't have any milk, but yesterday one of the fishermen had brought over a goat because his wife had kicked him out along with the goat, and he had nowhere else to take it. Tae-hyun took the goat. He milked it that morning. The milk was warm and rich and smelled like a living animal. He added it to the porridge. He added a pinch of salt. A drop of Ayla had grown yesterday, something that turned out to be a cross between honey and syrup, a viscous, golden liquid from the stem of a plant Ayla couldn't name, but which had appeared when Tae-hyun described honey to her. Porridge, milky, golden, with a hint of honey, with salt, with a scent that made you want to close your eyes and remember something that never was. He poured it into a bowl, set it in front of the girl. She looked at the bowl, then at him. Her eyes behind her glasses were large and wet. She asked what it was. He said porridge. She said it couldn't be porridge. Porridge is gray and odorless. He said this was porridge just as it should be. She picked up a spoon, a wooden one, scooped some up, and brought it to her mouth. Tae-hyun watched. Ayla watched. Seora watched from the doorway. The first bite, the girl froze. The spoon stopped at her lips. Her eyes closed. 3 seconds. 5. 10. Then she began to eat, quickly, hungrily, like someone who hadn't eaten not just for a day, but for 24 years. She ate and tears streamed down her cheeks and fell into the bowl, but she didn't stop. When the bowl was empty, she set it on the table. She took off her glasses. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Her hands were shaking. She said that old texts mentioned that porridge used to be golden, that she'd thought it was a metaphor, that it turned out not to be a metaphor. Then she looked at Tae-hyun and said her name was Lyra Mendez, that she was a librarian at the church's closed archive, that the archive contained texts no one had read in 300 years, that some of them contained recipes, real recipes, not the ones approved by the church, but the ones that existed before it, that she could bring them if he wanted. Tae-hyun wanted them. Lyra left an hour later, quietly, through the back door. Seora watched her go and said the girl was from the church. Tae-hyun said he knew. Seora said it might be a trap. Tae-hyun said he knew that too, but that a girl who hides her face behind a book and eats gray porridge once a day doesn't seem like a trap. Seora snorted. She didn't agree, but she didn't argue either. Leroy returned 3 days later, at night. She knocked on the back door so quietly that only Seora heard her. Under her cassock, she had a stack of parchments. She took them out with trembling hands and placed them on the table. Tae-hyun unfolded the first one. The parchment was old, fragile. The letters were small and faded, but he could read them just like the street signs. The language of this world flowed into his mind on its own. A recipe, sourdough bread with 3 rises. It described flour ground from grain that grows in sun-drenched fields, with a description of the crust, which should be dark and crispy, with a description of the crumb, which should be white and airy and smell of life. Tae-hyun read, and his hands trembled too. It was a real recipe, not a church-approved instruction manual, but a real recipe written by a chef who knew what he was doing. 300 years ago, someone in this world baked real bread. He turned the parchment over. On the back was a note in different handwriting, sharper, smaller. Prohibited by decree of the high priestess. Year 14 of the long fast. Destroy all copies. Tae-hyun placed the parchment on the table. He looked at Leroy. She stood there, pale, her hands behind her back, staring at the floor. She said she'd taken it out without permission, that if they found out, she'd be excommunicated, or worse. Tae-hyun was silent. Then he said she was brave. Leroy looked up. Behind her glasses, her eyes were wet. She said she wasn't brave, that she just wanted to taste real bread before she died. Tae-hyun said she would get to taste it, that he would bake it for her, that all he needed was flour, real flour. Not gray dust, but flour made from grain that remembers the sun. He looked at Ayla. Ayla met his gaze. She was already standing, already walking toward the back door, already knowing what she needed to grow. Tae-hyun didn't have time to say anything. She stepped out into the darkness and placed her hands on the ground. A minute later, the earth trembled, quietly, barely noticeably, and stalks began to emerge from it, green, bright, strong. They grew before his eyes, rising, growing stronger. Ears of grain appeared at the tips, heavy, golden, full, just like that wreath that had spun above Ayla's head on the first day. The very same ears of wheat that had been absent from this world for 300 years. Ayla stood in the middle of a small field of wheat that had sprung up in 3 minutes in the courtyard behind the rope warehouse in the port district of Mornhaven. Moonlight fell on the ears of wheat, and they glowed with a quiet golden light. Lyra followed her out. She saw the wheat. She saw the light. Her glasses glinted in the darkness. She stood and watched. Then she slowly took off her glasses and pressed them to her chest. Tae-hyun cut off a single ear of wheat. He shelled the kernels into his palm. He brought them to his nose. Wheat, real wheat, warm, alive, smelling of the sun that hadn't been seen in this world for 300 years. He clenched the grains in his fist and closed his eyes. Tomorrow, he would bake bread, real bread, the first real bread in 300 years, and he already knew for whom. Tae-hyun learned of the existence of olive oil on the southern islands and struck a deal with the fishermen. The librarian Lyra Mendez came to taste his food and then secretly took the forbidden recipes for real bread from the church archives. Ella grew real wheat in the courtyard. Tae-hyun is preparing to bake the first real bread in 300 years. Tae-hyun didn't sleep until dawn. He sat in front of the hearth, rereading the parchment. The recipe was detailed. Flour, water, salt, sourdough starter, 3 rises, a long proofing period, a hot oven. That was all he knew. That was all he could do. But there was one thing missing in this world: sourdough starter, yeast. That living element that makes the dough rise and turns bread into bread. Tae-hyun sat there, thinking. Then he stood up and went to see Ail. She was sleeping in the attic, curled up on a straw mattress that Seora had dragged in from somewhere. He woke her up. She opened her eyes immediately, without a moment's hesitation. The way people wake up who are used to the fact that waking up can mean danger. He told her he needed sourdough starter. He described it. Living organisms, microscopic ones, that eat sugar and release gas, that live in the air and on the surface of the grain, that make the dough fluffy and fragrant. Ella listened. Then she said she didn't understand. She could grow plants. But what he had described wasn't a plant. Tae-hyun sat down on the attic floor. He rubbed his face. He thought. Then he stood up and went downstairs. He took a bowl. He poured in some flour, that very same golden wheat flour that Ayla had grown that night. They'd ground it by hand. 2 stones, 3 hours of work. The flour turned out coarse and uneven, with lumps, but real. He added water, stirred it. It turned into a thick paste. He covered the bowl with a rag and set it by the hearth. Heat, moisture, flour, water, time. Sourdough doesn't need yeast from a packet. Sourdough needs patience. There are millions of wild yeast cells in the air around us. You just have to give them a home. Tae-hyun knew this. He'd made sourdough starter from scratch twice in his life, once in culinary school and once when he opened his bistro. Both times he waited 5 days. He waited. Every 12 hours he fed the mixture. Fresh flour, fresh water, stir, cover it, wait. On the second day, a faint sour smell appeared. On the third, bubbles. On the fourth, the mixture rose. On the morning of the 5th day, Tae-hyun lifted the cloth and saw a living, breathing sourdough starter. It smelled like sour bread and something else he couldn't quite put into words. Something ancient. As if the wild yeast of this world had been waiting 300 years for someone would give them flour again. He stood over the bowl and breathed in that scent. Ella stood beside him. Seora stood by the door. Lero had come that morning with another parchment and stood in the corner, clutching it to her chest. Tae-hyun said, today, he kneaded the dough on the stone floor. Flour, water, salt, sourdough starter with his hands. No mixer, no dough mixer. With hands that had kneaded dough thousands of times across 2 continents. The flour was coarse and the dough resisted. He kneaded for 20 minutes. Folded, stretched, folded, slammed it against the stone. Folded again. Ayla watched intently. Seora watched from the doorway. Lero watched from the dough became smooth, alive, warm beneath his fingers. Tae-hyun placed it in a pot and covered it. First rise. 2 hours. He couldn't sit idly by. While the dough was rising, he prepared broth for the evening guests. Fish broth, made from heads and spines, with onions, garlic, and salt. 4 hours over low heat. At the same time, he thought about the oven. The hearth wasn't suitable for bread. He needed heat from all sides. He needed a stone that would retain heat. He needed a vaulted ceiling. He told Seora that he needed an oven. Seora asked what kind. He described it. Stone. Dome-shaped, with thick walls, with an opening for the fire and an opening for the bread. Seora listened. Then she nodded. She stood up. She left. She returned 4 hours later with 3 dock workers. Each was carrying stones. Tae-hyun didn't ask where she'd found them or how she'd persuaded them. Seora had her own methods. The dock workers stacked the stones in the courtyard and left. Seora stayed behind. She built the oven herself, stone by stone, without mortar, with the precision of a soldier who knows what field fortifications are. Tae-hyun showed her the shape. She built it. By evening, a stone oven stood in the courtyard, rough, a bit crooked, but with a dome, with a vaulted ceiling, with openings in the right places. Tae-hyun lit a fire in it and heated the stones for 2 hours. By this time, the dough had gone through all 3 rises, alive, breathing. With bubbles beneath the surface, he shaped the loaf with his hands on a stone dusted with flour. He scored the top with a knife, 3 crisscross cuts, and placed it in the oven. The aroma began to waft out 10 minutes later. Tae-hyun stood by the oven and listened. The bread was singing. He knew that sound. The quiet crackling of the crust forming in the heat, the hiss of moisture evaporating from the crumb. That sound was the same on Earth and in Illyria. Bread is bread, in any world. 40 minutes later, he took the loaf out. It was dark gold, with a crispy crust, cracked where the slashes were, hollow on the bottom, a dull thud when he tapped the bottom with his knuckles. Done. He set the loaf on a stone and waited. 10 minutes, the bread had to cool, not completely, but enough. 10 minutes during which he stood and looked at the loaf, and 4 women stood around him, looking at him and at the loaf, and no one said a word. Then he broke the bread apart with his hands, in half. Steam burst from the crumb. White, hot, with a scent that made Liro close her eyes and press her palm to her mouth. The crumb was white, porous, soft, with holes from the yeast gas. The crust crunched as he broke it. Tae-hyun tore off 4 pieces. He handed one to Ayla, one to Seora, one to Lyra. He kept one for himself. Ayla took hers first. She took a bite, chewed slowly, closed her eyes, opened them, looked at the bread in her hand, then at Tae-hyun. She didn't say anything, but her eyes said it all. Seora took a bite. She chewed, keeping her eyes open, looking straight at Tae-hyun. Then she nodded once, briefly, as if saluting. Liro took a piece with both hands, brought it to her face, and sniffed it for a long time. Then she took a small bite, and she began to cry, quietly, silently. Tears streamed down her cheeks and fell onto the bread. She ate and cried and couldn't stop. Her glasses fogged up. She took them off and closed her eyes tightly, and Tae-hyun saw the light, not as bright as Ayla's, quiet, flickering, silver, not gold. It emanated from Lyra's fingers, from the fingertips with which she held the bread. The light crept up her arms, across her robe. The robe changed. The gray, faded fabric turned dark blue like the night sky. Bright lines ran across the fabric. Letters, hundreds of letters, thousands. They shimmered and moved as if alive. A ring appeared above Lyra's head, not a wreath like Ayla's, a ring of silvery light, in which symbols floated in languages that hadn't been spoken in this world for 1,000 years. Lyra opened her eyes. They were silvery, glowing. She stood in the middle of the courtyard, barefoot, wearing a dark blue robe covered in living letters, with a ring of ancient symbols above her head and bread in her hands. She looked at her hands, then at Tae-hyun. Then, in a quiet voice, she said that she remembered. Tae-hyun asked what she remembered. She said everything that had been recorded, every line, every book, every scroll, every parchment, everything that had ever been written in this world, including what the church had destroyed, including recipes, all the recipes. Tae-hyun stood there, looking at the 3rd goddess in a month. Then he looked at Ayla. Ayla was smiling, broadly, brightly, like someone who had found a sister. Then he looked at Seora. Seora stood with a piece of bread in her hand, and her face bore an expression he could finally read. Relief, pure, deep relief, like a soldier who realized the war wasn't lost. Tae-hyun looked at his flour-covered hands, then at the bread, then at the sky, pale, colorless. He didn't know why this was happening, didn't know why the women he fed were turning into goddesses, didn't know what rules governed it. He knew only one thing. The bread had turned out well, and tomorrow he'll bake an even better loaf. Tae-hyun had cultivated the sourdough starter in 5 days and baked the first real bread in 300 years. Seora had built a stone oven in the courtyard. Leroy Mendez tasted the bread and awoke as the goddess of knowledge. She now remembers everything that has ever been recorded in this world, including the recipes destroyed by the church. 3 goddesses in one kitchen. Tae-hyun quickly realized that this wasn't a gift, but a challenge. Ayla would get up before dawn and head out to the garden. She'd return with an armful of vegetables. She'd arrange them on the table, neatly, by size, carrots with carrots, onions with onions. Then she'd sit in the corner and wait for Tae-hyun to look and nod. If he nodded, she'd smile. If he shook his head, she'd run back to the garden and try again. Seora got up even earlier. She walked around the neighborhood. She checked the doors, she checked the windows, she checked the roof. Then she returned and stood by the entrance. If guests arrived, she let them in. If non-guests arrived, she didn't let them in. She could tell the difference instantly. A soldier's instinct. Leroy arrived later, quietly, through the back door. In the morning, she worked at the temple library. She pretended that nothing had changed. She hid her blue cassock under an old gray one. She banished the silver light from her eyes. She could control it. She clenched her fists, and the glow faded. But every evening, she came to the restaurant and sat in a corner with parchment and a quill and wrote down recipes, the ones she remembered, every single one. Tae-hyun stood by the hearth and listened as she dictated. Lotus root soup with white pepper, roasted venison with juniper and honey, a pie with 3 kinds of mushrooms on a butter pastry crust. The recipes poured out of her like water. She remembered everything, the exact proportions, the temperatures, the timing, techniques that hadn't been used in this world for 300 years. Tae-hyun listened, and a fire burned inside him. Not from passion, from hunger, the professional hunger of a chef who'd found a library of recipes just when he thought they'd run out. The problem lay elsewhere. 3 women, 3 goddesses. Each looked at him as if he were the center of the world. Ayla said nothing, but brought him the finest vegetables, set them before him, and waited. Seora said nothing, but stood between him and any danger. Lyro remained silent, but wrote down recipes for him until dawn. Tae-hyun wasn't a fool. He'd worked in a restaurant for 8 years and had seen how people looked at one another. He knew what that look meant, but he didn't have time for that. He had a restaurant, 25 guests every evening, 1 oven, 1 hearth, 3 pots, and the church watching over them. On the 30th day since they'd first set up shop in this space, Tae-hyun made a decision. He removed the curtain from the door. He hung up a sign. Hey, Lyro wrote 2 words for him in beautiful handwriting on a piece of wood. Hearth. The restaurant was called Hearth. It was a risky move. It was an open declaration. The sign meant he was no longer hiding, that he was a cook and he cooked, and anyone who wanted to was welcome to come. Seora was against it. She said the sign would attract the church's attention. Tae-hyun said the church already knew. 2 observers in dark robes stood on the corner every evening. They saw the line. They smelled the food. There was no point in hiding. Seora clenched her jaw. She said nothing, but she polished her sword longer than usual that evening. On the first night with the sign up, 40 people came, 25 regulars and 15 newcomers. Tae-hyun wasn't prepared for that many. He had 3 pots. He simmered broth in the first one, soup in the second, porridge in the third. Ayla chopped vegetables crookedly but quickly. Seora hauled water and firewood. Lyro sat at the table and kept track of who came, what they ordered, and how much they paid. She did this on her own. No one asked her to. She just saw what needed to be done and got started. That evening, Tae-hyun worked for 5 hours straight. His hands moved on autopilot. Chop, toss, stir, taste, salt, more salt, stir, ladle out. He wasn't thinking. His body remembered. 8 years in the kitchen had ingrained every movement into his muscles. When the last guest left, Tae-hyun sat down on the floor and couldn't get up for 10 minutes. Ayla brought him some water. Seora stood by the door and waited. Leroy placed the records in front of him. 40 guests, 40 copper coins, expenses, salt, meat, firewood. Net profit for the evening, 18 copper coins. Tae-hyun looked at the numbers, then at Leroy. She adjusted her glasses and said that at this rate, in 17 days, they'd have enough for a barrel of oil. Tae-hyun laughed. For the first time in a month in this world. A short, hoarse laugh from a weary man who realized that things were, after all, heading in the right direction. The second month began with a knock on the door at 6 in the morning. Tae-hyun opened it. A girl was standing on the threshold, red hair, freckles, hands marked by old burns from hot pots, a wide smile that didn't reach her eyes. She said she'd heard that the new cook was looking for help, that she'd been working at her father's tavern since she was 12, that she could carry 8 plates at once, that she needed a job because her father drinks and the tavern had closed. Tae-hyun looked at her. Hands scarred from burns, a smile that didn't reach her eyes, 8 plates at once, 12 years in her drunk father's tavern. He asked her name. She said Hana Park. She's 22. Tae-hyun let her in. Hana stepped inside and looked around. A small room, a hearth, 3 pots, a table, benches, a smell that made her stop halfway. She sniffed the air for 3 seconds. Then she turned to him and asked what that smell was. He said, "Food." She said, "Food doesn't smell like that." He said it does now. She started working that very same day. Seora watched her warily for the first 2 hours. Then she stopped. Hana moved through the dining hall like a fish in water. She knew where to place a bowl, how to approach a guest, when to pour more, and when to clear the table. She smiled at everyone, and everyone smiled back. But Tae-hyun saw it. When she thought no one was watching, her smile vanished like a mask being removed. Beneath it was the face of a tired person, very tired. After her first shift, Hana was about to leave. Tae-hyun stopped her. He asked if she'd eaten today. She said, "Of course." He looked at her, and she looked away. He poured a bowl of soup, vegetable soup, thick, with potatoes, onions, and garlic. He set it in front of her. She looked at the bowl. She looked at him. Her red hair fell across her face. She tucked it behind her ear. He saw a bruise on her wrist, an old one. Yellow, healing. She noticed he'd seen it. She quickly pulled her sleeve down. He didn't say anything. She ate in silence. No tears, no light, no awakening. She just ate. When she finished, she said thank you and left. Tae-hyun stood by the door and watched her go. Ayla approached. She stood beside him. "Is she like me?" she asked quietly. Tae-hyun said, "I don't know," but he didn't like the bruise on her wrist. Hana came every morning. She worked all day. She ate after her shift. Tae-hyun fed her every time. He didn't ask any questions. He just set the bowl down. She ate. On the 3rd day, after she finished eating, she stayed. She sat on the bench and watched Tae-hyun wash the pots. Then she asked if she could help. He gave her a rag. They washed the dishes side by side, in silence. On the 5th day, she stayed the night. She said it was too far to walk home. Tae-hyun didn't ask why, really. He made a bed for her on the bench. She fell asleep instantly, like someone who hadn't slept safely in a long time. In the middle of the night, Tae-hyun woke up to a sound. Quiet. Faint, like a bell wrapped in cotton. He opened his eyes. Hana was sleeping on the bench, and she was glowing. A warm orange light, like embers in a hearth. It was coming from her hands, from the palms that had once carried 8 plates at once. The light pulsed in time with her breathing. Quietly, calmly, Tae-hyun sat in the dark and watched. The 4th time, he didn't even try to panic. He was already used to it. In the morning, Hana woke up and didn't know. The light went out when she opened her eyes. She got up, washed her face, went to work. Tae-hyun didn't tell her yet, but he noticed something. The guests at her tables weren't arguing. The 2 sailors who had nearly come to blows over a seat the night before were sitting side by side, peacefully eating soup. The old fisherman, who never spoke to anyone, was telling Hana a story about fish, and she laughed, and he laughed, and everyone around them laughed. The guests in her section were leaving more tips, not because she asked them to, because they didn't want to leave. Tae-hyun stood by the hearth and watched. Hana moved through the dining room, and the room changed around her. It grew warmer. It grew calmer. People ate more slowly. They spoke more quietly. They stayed longer. He didn't know what to call it, but he knew that Hana Park was no longer just a waitress, and that soon he would have to tell her that. The restaurant got a sign and began serving 40 guests a day. Hana Park came to work as a waitress and awoke as the 4th goddess in a dream after Tae-hyun fed her every day. She doesn't know about her awakening yet, but the guests in her section are behaving inexplicably peacefully. She's writing down ancient recipes from memory with a lyre. Tae-hyun told Hana on the 7th day. In the morning, before opening, the 2 of them were sitting at a table. He placed a bowl of porridge in front of her. Golden porridge with milk and honey, the very same one. She ate. He waited. When she finished, he said that on the night after her first day of work, she had been glowing. Hana stopped her spoon. She looked at him. He was expecting tears, or fear, or denial. Hana smiled. She said she knew that she'd woken up in the middle of the night and seen a light on her hands. She thought she was dreaming. Then she realized she wasn't. Tae-hyun asked why she hadn't said anything. Hana shrugged. She said she'd been doing strange things her whole life. People around her calmed down. Fights didn't break out. Drunk people fell asleep instead of causing a ruckus. She'd thought it was a coincidence. Now she thought it wasn't. Tae-hyun looked at her. Sitting in front of him was a 22-year-old red-headed girl with freckles, old burns on her hands, and a bruise on her wrist. And she wasn't afraid. She was the only one of the 4 who wasn't afraid. He asked why. She said that after 12 years with a drunk father, drunk guests, wet rags, and hot trays, she had nothing left to be afraid of. That glowing in the night was the least dangerous thing that had ever happened to her. Tae-hyun nodded. Then he said she couldn't go back to her father. Hana froze. He said he'd seen the bruise, that he knew where it came from, that she'd stay here, that there was an attic upstairs, that Ella and Lira were already there, that one more mattress wouldn't make a difference. Hana looked at him. For the first time ever, her smile reached her eyes. She said, "All right." Then she got up and went to work, and from that day on, she never left. 4 goddesses, 1 chef, 1 restaurant. Tae-hyun sometimes caught himself thinking that in a past life he'd had a kitchen staff of 20 people and had managed it more easily than these 4, not because they got in the way, because each one helped in her own way, and each one wanted to help more than the rest. Ala would bring the vegetables in the morning, line them up on the table, and wait for him to give his approval. If Hana approached the table first, Ayla would freeze. She wasn't angry. She just waited, quietly, patiently. But her eyes spoke volumes. Sayora stood by the door, keeping watch, but sometimes she would come inside. She'd watch as Tae-hyun cut the meat. Then, without a word, she'd take a second knife and start cutting beside him. She cut the meat better than he did, more precisely, more cleanly. The hands of a soldier, accustomed to the blade. Tae-hyun once told her that she cut better than he did. Sayora didn't say anything, but he noticed that from that day on, she cut meat every evening. Liro would come home after her shift at the library. She'd sit down at the table, open a notebook, write down recipes. Sometimes Tae-hyun would ask her about an ingredient, and she'd start talking. And she couldn't stop. She knew everything, the history of every grain, the origin of every spice, the journey of every recipe through the centuries and across countries. As she spoke, her eyes would gleam silver, her glasses reflecting the light from the hearth, and she'd forget her shyness. In those moments, she was beautiful. Tae-hyun noticed this, and he would turn away toward the pots. Hana managed the dining room. She knew the name of every regular. She knew who liked their soup thicker, who asked for seconds but was too shy to ask for them themselves, who came alone and who needed someone to chat with. She was the bridge between the kitchen and the guests loved her. One evening, an old sailor told Tae-hyun that he didn't come here for the food. He came for the warmth. Tae-hyun asked what kind of warmth. The sailor nodded toward Hana. He said that when she was around, it felt like everything would be all right. Tae-hyun looked at Hana. She was standing by the table, laughing at the fisherman's joke. An orange light flickered at the tips of her fingers, barely noticeable. No one saw it but him. The restaurant was growing. 50 guests, 60. A line out on the street. Tae-hyun bought a 4th pot, a 5th, a 2nd table, a 3rd. Benches, bowls, spoons. The barrel of oil finally arrived. 3 gold coins. He paid. When he opened the barrel and poured the oil onto the hot stone, it sizzled, and the aroma shot up to the ceiling and spread throughout the room. All 4 of them froze. Ayla, Sayora, Lyro, Hana. They stood there, breathing in the scent. Tae-hyun sautéed onions and garlic in the oil. He added chopped carrots. He let it simmer for 15 minutes. Then he poured in the broth, salt, a pinch of something that Leroy found in her memory and that Ayla had grown. Thyme, real thyme. Olive oil soup with thyme. In a world where oil was considered lubricant for machinery. That evening, 70 guests arrived. Tae-hyun couldn't handle it all by himself. Ayla took charge of the knife. Sayora took charge of the meat. Leroy took charge of the orders. Hana darted between the tables. They worked as a single unit, without words, without commands. Each knew what to do. Tae-hyun stood by the hearth, cooking, frying, stirring, tasting, and adding ingredients. And at some point, he caught himself smiling. Not because everything was going well, because the kitchen was running smoothly. The line was holding up, orders were coming in. And the 4 women around him moved as if they'd been doing this their whole lives. After closing, they sat at the table, tired. Tae-hyun ladled the remaining soup into bowls. 5 bowls. 5 people. They ate in silence. Then Hana said there would be even more people tomorrow. Tae-hyun nodded. Then Sayora said that tomorrow there wouldn't just be people. Everyone looked at her. Sayora said that today she had seen not 2 observers, but 4. And one of them wasn't wearing a dark robe, but a white one. A white robe signified high rank. Someone important figure in the church had taken notice of the small restaurant in the harbor district. Tae-hyun took a sip of soup. He set down his bowl. He looked at the 4 women. He said that tomorrow he would add bread to the menu. Seora opened her mouth to object. He raised his hand. He said that the church had banned authentic recipes 300 years ago, that he bakes bread using a recipe that's 300 years old, that this bread had awakened Lyro, that if the church wants to come, let them come, but he won't stop baking. 4 pairs of eyes stared at him, gray, light, silvery, brown with a hint of red. He finished his soup. He stood up. He went to prepare the sourdough starter for tomorrow. Tae-hyun told Hana about her awakening and took her away from her father's house. The restaurant had grown to serve 70 guests. Tae-hyun received a barrel of olive oil and introduced new dishes. The church stepped up its surveillance and sent a high-ranking man in a white robe. Tae-hyun decided to add bread to the menu, despite the threat. The bread changed everything. Tae-hyun baked 3 loaves every morning. Ella grew wheat at night. They ground the grain by hand, Ayla and Hana using 2 millstones for 2 hours. Tae-hyun kneaded the dough at dawn, 3 rising cycles. The oven in the courtyard, 40 minutes per loaf. By noon, the bread was ready. He sliced it into thick slices, served it with soup, for free, to every guest. The first day with bread, a guest took a slice, sniffed it, took a bite, froze, chewed slowly. He closed his eyes, opened them, looked at the bread, looked at Tae-hyun, asked what it was. Tae-hyun said, bread. The guest said the bread wasn't like that the bread was gray and soft and had no smell. Tae-hyun said that's how it was now. The second day with bread, the line on the street formed 2 hours before opening. The third day, 3 hours before, people came from other neighborhoods, from the upper city, from the commercial districts. Dock workers told the sailors told the merchants told their wives. The wives came. For the first time, women came to the restaurant. Before that, only men had come. The women walked in and sat down. Hana served them. They ate soup and bread and said nothing. Then one of them began to cry. Then a second. Then all of them. They sat at the table, eating bread and crying. Not out of grief, out of something they couldn't name. Tae-hyun stood by the hearth and watched. This was familiar to him. At the restaurant in Seoul, there were moments when a guest would cry over their plate. Rarely, but it happened. When a dish touched some spot inside a person that they had been hiding for years. Here, it happened every day, because for 300 years, the whole world had been hiding that same spot. Taste. On the 5th day, the church arrived. Not observers, not a man in a white robe, a delegation. 3 men and 1 woman. The men in black robes. The woman in white. Older than the rest, about 50. Thin, with the face of someone accustomed to being listened to. They entered when the restaurant was full. 80 guests, every table occupied, a line at the door. Seora saw them first. She stood in the aisle, her hand on her sword. The woman in the white robe looked at Seora, then at the sword, then back at Seora. She said they hadn't come to fight, that they'd come to speak with the chef. Seora didn't move. Tae-hyun stepped out from behind the hearth. He wiped his hands on a rag. He looked at the delegation. He said they could talk after dinner. He said that if they wanted to wait, they could sit down. If they wanted to eat, he would bring them something. The woman in the white robe looked at him for 10 seconds. Then she sat down. The 3 men sat down behind her. Seora stepped back, but she stood so that she could see them from anywhere in the hall. Hana approached. She placed 4 bowls in front of them. Soup, bread. The woman in the white robe looked at the soup. She sniffed it. She looked at the bread. She picked up a slice. She turned it over in her hands. She pressed it with her finger. The crust crunched. She looked up at Tae-hyun. He had already returned to the hearth. She took a bite of the bread. Tae-hyun wasn't watching. He was cooking soup for the next group of guests. But he could hear it. The silence at that table. A long silence. Then the sound of a spoon against a bowl. Then another. They were eating. When the restaurant closed, the delegation remained. The dining room was empty. Tae-hyun sat across from the woman. Seora stood behind him. Ayla was at the hearth. Lyro was in the corner. Hana was by the door. The woman introduced herself, High Priestess Inara, the 3rd highest ranking official in the Church of the Long Fast. She said she knew who he was. She explained that a chef who prepares food not according to approved recipes is breaking the law. The fine for the first offense is 10 gold pieces. For the second, the establishment will be shut down. For the third, imprisonment. Tae-hyun listened. Then he asked if she had enjoyed the soup. Inara fell silent. One of the men in a black robe leaned forward. He said this was no joke, that the church would not tolerate it. Seora, standing behind Tae-hyun, stirred. Tae-hyun raised his hand. The man fell silent. Tae-hyun looked at Inara. Inara looked at him. Then she said the soup was the best she'd ever had in her life, that the bread had reminded her of her grandmother, who had died when Inara was 6, that she hadn't known food could do that. Tae-hyun nodded. He said that food could do much more than that. Inara was silent for a moment. Then she said that this didn't change the law, that she was obligated to impose a fine, that she was obligated to report it to the High Priestess Moriel. Tae-hyun asked what would happen when the High Priestess found out. Inara stood up. She looked down at him. She said that High Priestess Moriel had been protecting the world from chaos for 80 years, that if she decided the restaurant threatened order, the restaurant would be shut down. Tae-hyun stood up too. He looked her in the eyes. He said that he bakes bread. That bread isn't chaos. That bread is just bread. Inara turned and walked toward the door. She stopped at the threshold. Without turning around, she said the fine was 10 gold pieces, that he had 7 days. Then she left. 3 men followed her. The door closed. Tae-hyun stood there and did the math. 10 gold pieces. 1,000 copper coins. At his current profit margin, that's 2 months' work. Seora said they didn't have to pay, that she could take care of whoever came to collect. Tae-hyun said no. He said they would pay, that he wouldn't go to war with the church. Not yet, that the war would begin when he decided it would, not when the church decides. Liro raised her hand. Everyone looked at her. She blushed, but she spoke up. There are trade records from 300 years ago in the archives. They list the prices of dishes, real dishes, from before Lent. The prices were 10 times higher than what Tae-hyun charges. Tae-hyun looked at her, then at Hana. Hana nodded. She'd known the restaurant business since she was 12. She said that if they doubled the prices, half the customers would leave, but the other half would stay. And 10 gold coins a month was realistic. Tae-hyun thought for a minute, then he said, no, don't raise the prices. Instead, add a second dish for a fee. Bread separately. Anyone who wants soup pays 1 copper coin, just like before. Anyone who wants soup and bread pays 3 copper coins. Hannah did the math in her head. She said that if 60 out of 80 customers ordered bread, that would bring in an extra 120 copper coins a day, 10 gold coins for 8 days. Tae-hyun nodded. The next day, he introduced bread as a separate dish. 70 out of 80 took bread. Leroa jotted down the numbers and looked up at him. There was something new in her eyes. Not admiration, respect. 7 days later, Tae-hyun placed 10 gold coins on the table in front of Inara. Inara counted them. She looked at him. He looked at her. She put the coins away. She stood up. She paused at the door again. Without turning around, she said that High Priestess Morel wanted to see him in a month at the temple. The door closed. Tae-hyun sat down. 4 women stood around him. He looked at each of them. Then he said that in a month they would have a second oven and a 3rd floor, and that he needed to learn how to bake pies. The bread had attracted a huge number of guests, including women from the upper city. The church sent a delegation led by High Priestess Inara and imposed a fine of 10 gold pieces. Tae-hyun paid the fine in 8 days by raising the price of bread. High Priestess Moriel scheduled a meeting with him in a month at the temple. Dice 1 month before the meeting with the High Priestess. Tae-hyun worked harder than ever. Bread in the morning, broths and soups in the afternoon, a full house in the evening, 90 guests, then 100. The place was bursting at the seams. Seora found some builders, the same dock workers who had hauled stones for the oven. They tore down the wall between the restaurant and the former fish shop. The shop owner sold the space for a price that made Liro go pale. But Tae-hyun paid it. The dining hall doubled in size. A second hearth, a second oven, 6 tables, 20 stools. Tae-hyun stood in the middle of the new dining room and counted the seats, 40. The small restaurant in Seoul had been bigger. But this one was his, truly his. Not the investors, not the partners, his. Ella had expanded the vegetable garden. Now there was a real garden behind the house. Tomatoes. Tae-hyun had described the tomatoes to her 3 days ago. Red, round, with thin skin and soft flesh. With a scent that makes summer begin on the tip of your tongue. With juice that runs down your chin when you take a bite. Ella listened with her eyes closed. Then she placed her palms on the ground. 2 days later, red spheres hung in the garden bed. Tae-hyun picked one. He took a bite. Juice ran down his chin. He stood in the garden behind the rope shed, eating the tomato. And for a second, the world around him ceased to feel foreign. The tomato was perfect, sweet, sour, with that very hint of umami that can't be explained in words. Ayla stood nearby and watched. He held out the tomato to her. She took a bite. She froze. Her eyes widened. She said she didn't know that was possible. He said it was possible, that it was meant to be that way, that a world where tomatoes are tasteless is a world that's sick. The tomatoes changed the menu. Tae-hyun made a sauce, a simple one. Tomatoes simmered with garlic, onions, olive oil, salt, and thyme. 4 hours over low heat. The tomatoes fell apart. The sauce thickened. It turned red. The aroma filled the hall and spilled out onto the street. He served the sauce with bread. You dip the bread in the sauce and eat. That's it. Nothing complicated. But in a world where tomatoes hadn't grown for 300 years, it was like a thunderclap. People came just for the sauce. Women from the upper city sent servants with jugs. Pour us some of that red stuff. Tae-hyun poured it. Money poured in. He didn't think about money. He thought about the menu, about what else he could make. Leroa dictated recipes to him every evening. He listened. He sorted them out in his head. This one can be made right now. Not this one, because we don't have cream. Not this one, because we don't have pepper. This one? Yes, if Ayla grows peas. The peas grew in a day. Green, sweet, crunchy. Tae-hyun made pea soup with mint and salt. He served it cold. In this world, no one ate cold soup. The guests looked at the bowl of green liquid and didn't understand. Then they tasted it and couldn't stop. The restaurant's menu changed every week. Tae-hyun introduced a new dish every 3 days. Soup, porridge, roast, braised vegetables, roasted vegetables, raw vegetables with salt and oil, salad. No one in Mornhaven knew the word salad. Tae-hyun explained. Fresh vegetables chopped and dressed with oil and salt. The guests tried it cautiously. Then they asked for seconds. But amid this growth, Tae-hyun noticed things that troubled him. One late evening after closing, he went out into the courtyard. He sat on a stone by the furnace. He looked up at the stars. The stars here were pale, too, like everything else. Behind him, the door creaked. Yoon. He'd known her for 3 weeks. She ran a tea shop 2 blocks from the restaurant. A small, quiet place with 3 tables and the scent of something that in this world was called tea, but was, in essence, hot water with dried herbs. Tae-hyun had walked in by chance. He was looking for something hot for himself. Not for guests, for himself. He was tired of his own food. A chef who eats only his own cooking goes crazy. He needs someone else's taste, someone else's touch, someone else's decision. Mirai handed him a cup. Hot water with pale herbs. He looked at the cup, then at her. She was 30, beautiful with a quiet, weary beauty. Dark hair with early gray at the temples, large dark eyes, dark circles under her eyes. Her hands were slender. On her ring finger was the mark of a ring she no longer wore. He didn't ask. He drank his tea in silence. She sat across from him, silently. They were silent for 15 minutes. Then he left. The next day, he came back, and the next, and the next. Every evening after the restaurant closed. 15 minutes of silence, a cup of hot water with herbs. They didn't talk. They didn't introduce themselves. They just sat in silence. A week later, she spoke first. She said her husband had died 8 years ago, and her son, during the epidemic that swept through the port district. The boy was 4 years old. Tae-hyun listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't offer comfort. He didn't say he understood. He just listened. She spoke for 10 minutes. Then she fell silent. He finished his tea. He left. The next evening, he brought her a meal. Not soup, not bread, rice. Ella had harvested the rice 2 days earlier. White, short grain. Tae-hyun cooked it just like he did when he was a child, in a thick pot with a lid, over low heat, 20 minutes. Then he took it off the heat and let it sit for 10 minutes. Then he opened the lid. Steam, the smell, warm, pure, like a home that no longer exists. He put the rice in a bowl. On top, a thin slice of salted fish, a drop of oil. A pinch of green onions. He set it in front of Mireille. She looked at the bowl for a long time, then at him, then back at the bowl. Her hands trembled. She said her son loved rice. That she used to cook rice for him every morning. That after his death, she couldn't bear to look at rice. That she'd stopped cooking it. That over the past 8 years, she'd forgotten what it smelled like. Tae-hyun remained silent. Mireille picked up a spoon, scooped up some rice, brought it to her mouth. She ate slowly, with her eyes closed. She didn't cry. She didn't break down. She just ate. When she finished, she set the bowl on the table. She looked at him. Her eyes were dry. She said thank you. He nodded. He left. From that evening on, he brought her food every day. Different kinds, simple things. Rice, broth, vegetables, bread and butter. Nothing complicated, nothing grand. Food for a weary woman who had lived with grief as if it were a second body for 8 years. He didn't try to surprise her, didn't try to rouse her, didn't think about goddesses or light or ears of grain. He simply fed a person who had forgotten what it meant to eat, not just to survive, but to live. Mireille accepted the food in silence. She ate in silence. Sometimes after a meal, they would sit together in silence. Sometimes she would speak about her son, about her husband, about the shop, about the tea, which wasn't tasty but was hot, and that was something. Tae-hyun listened. After 3 weeks, he noticed that she had started taking care of herself, combing her hair, washing her dress, wiping down the windows in the shop. Little things, signs that a person had begun to remember that she was alive. The courtyard, night, the stars. Tae-hyun sat on a rock by the stove and thought about his meeting with the high priestess. In 2 weeks, he didn't know what to expect. Lero told him about Moriel, 80 years old, skinny as a twig, with the voice of a young woman. She became the high priestess at 30, 50 years in power. She isn't evil. She's a woman of conviction. She believes that the long fast saved the world, that without the fast, the world would have perished. That taste is not a loss, but a sacrifice. Tae-hyun listened and realized this wouldn't be a conversation. It would be a clash of 2 worlds. A world where food is fuel, and a world where food is conversation. He sat and thought. Then he stood up. He went to the kitchen. He put a pot on the stove. He began to cook broth, not for guests, not to sell, for his meeting with the high priestess. He would cook this broth for 2 weeks, adding to it every day, strengthening it every day, taking 1 step closer to what he wants to say. Because Tae-hyun knew one thing, the one thing he had always known, the one thing that was his only weapon and his only language. He doesn't know how to persuade with words, but he knows how to cook. And if High Priestess Moriel hasn't eaten anything but gray porridge for 80 years, then he'll cook her something that will make her forget all her convictions for a single second, for a single bite. And that will be enough. The restaurant expanded and began serving up to 100 guests. Ela grew tomatoes and rice. Tae-hyun met Mireille and began bringing her food every evening. Mireille has not yet awakened. Tae-hyun began preparing a special broth for his upcoming meeting with High Priestess Moriel. For 2 weeks leading up to his meeting with the High Priestess, Tae-hyun simmered the broth. Every morning he woke up before dawn. He walked over to the pot. He lifted the lid. He sniffed. He tasted. He thought. He added ingredients. This broth was unlike anything he had ever made before, neither in Seoul nor in Illyria. He started with bones, beef bones. Seora had brought them from the market. Heavy bones, marrow bones. Tae-hyun charred them in the oven until they were black. Then he poured in water, cold water. He set it over the lowest heat, so low that the bubbles barely stirred on the surface. For the first day, he added nothing, just bones, water, and time. On the second day, he added an onion, whole, with the skin on, golden. He charred it on a stone until it turned to coals. He put it in the broth. On the third day, garlic, a whole head. On the fourth, carrots. On the fifth, a celery stalk that Ayla had grown according to his description and that smelled exactly as it should. Sharp, green, slightly bitter. 1 ingredient every day. Every day the broth changed. It thickened. It darkened. It gained depth. Tae-hyun strained it every evening through a cloth, skimmed off the fat, returned it to the heat. In the morning, he tasted it, closed his eyes, thought. On the 8th day, he added thyme. On the 9th day, a bay leaf. Haela had grown the bay tree in 2 days, a small tree in a pot. The leaves were dark green, thick, with a scent Tae-hyun hadn't smelled since the death. He held the leaf to his nose and breathed it in, and for a second he was in Seoul in his own kitchen, at 3 in the morning, alone, with the broth simmering for tomorrow's lunch. Then he opened his eyes and was back here. On the 10th day, he added pepper. black pepper. Leroy remembered that there was a recipe in the archives from the trade caravans that carried pepper across the Kelt Mountain Pass. The pepper grew on the southern slopes beyond the pass. The journey took 2 months. Tae-hyun couldn't wait 2 months. He described the pepper to Ayla, a vine, twining, with small green berries that turned black when dried. Inside was a seed that burned the tongue when chewed. Ella listened for a long time. Then she went out to the garden. A day later, she returned, pale and tired, but with a handful of black peppercorns in her palm. Tae-hyun took one. He crushed it between his fingers. He sniffed it, pepper, milder than what he was used to, but pepper nonetheless. He ground the peppercorns with a stone. He added a pinch to the broth. He tasted it an hour later. He stood by the pot, unable to move. The broth was ready, not perfect, far from what he could have made in his own kitchen and soul with decent ingredients. But for this world, for this moment, for this encounter, it was good enough. No, it was better than good enough. It was the truth. The liquid, hot, salty truth about what the world could be like if we stopped starving it. Tae-hyun poured the broth into a clay jug. He sealed the lid, wrapped it in a rag, set it by the hearth so it wouldn't get cold. The morning of the meeting, Tae-hyun put on a clean jacket, his own, the very one he'd been born in. Ayla had washed and mended it, and it was white, truly white. The only white chef's jacket in the world of Illyria. He took the jug, 2 earthenware bowls, a spoon. He walked to the door. All 4 were standing by the exit. Ayla, Seora, Leroy, Hana. Seora said she was going with him. Tae-hyun said no. Seora didn't say anything, but her jaw went rigid. He looked at her. He said that if he didn't return by evening, they would close the restaurant, take whatever they could carry, and leave. Out of the city, out of Mornhaven, anywhere. Seora started to speak. He raised his hand. He said it wasn't up for discussion, that he was going alone because he was a chef, not a general, that his weapon was a pitcher, not a sword, and that the 4 goddesses barging into the temple wouldn't be a conversation. It would be war, and he wanted a conversation. Seora was silent. Ayla was silent. Leroy was silent. Hana said only one word. Come back. Tae-hyun nodded. He left. The temple stood on a hill at the end of the main street. Tae-hyun walked through the city with a jug in his hands. People looked at him. They recognized him. The cook from the port, the man who bakes bread. Some nodded. Some looked away. The church had imposed a fine. Everyone knew it, and everyone knew he'd paid it, and carried on. The temple was enormous inside. Stone columns stretched up into the darkness of the ceiling. The floor was made of slabs worn smooth by millions of feet. Candles, hundreds of candles. The smell of wax and dust and something ancient. Tae-hyun walked down the central aisle. His footsteps echoed. At the far end of the hall, on a raised platform, stood a chair. Stone, simple. A woman sat in it. Thin, old, with a face that had once been beautiful but was now something greater than beauty. It was the face of a person who had known the world longer than most trees. Her eyes were dark, alive, young in an old face. When she spoke, her voice was that of a 30-year-old woman. She said she knew who he was, that she knew what he was doing, that she knew about bread and soup and butter and tomatoes, that she knew about the goddesses. Tae-hyun stopped 10 paces from the chair. He set the pitcher on the floor. He straightened up. She knew about the goddesses. He asked where she'd heard it. Moriel smiled, subtly, without warmth. She said that the church knew everything, that the observers had seen Ayla on the first day, that they'd sensed Lyro's awakening, that they'd tracked Hana through changes in the guest's behavior, that they had even noted Seoru, who hadn't awakened like the others, because a wound that healed overnight from the broth wasn't medicine, it was divinity. Tae-hyun remained silent. Moriel stood up. She was small, a head shorter than him, but when she stood, the air in the temple changed. It grew heavier, as if the ceiling had dropped by a meter. She said that 300 years ago, the Celestial Council had made a decision to remove taste from the world, to destroy what made food a joy, because the joy of eating gave birth to goddesses, and the goddesses born of joy were free, uncontrollable. They loved mortals. They lived among humans. They did not obey the council. The council decided this was chaos, and so it excised taste, just as a surgeon excises a tumor, so that new goddesses would be born of ritual, of obedience, of control. Tae-hyun listened. Moriel continued speaking. She said that the rituals had failed, that for 300 years not a single goddess had been born through ritual, that the council was wrong, that by cutting out pleasure they had cut out not chaos but life, that the world